Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. The recent split at the federal level in Australia of the coalition of the Liberal Party and the National Party has sparked discussion about how the tensions on the conservative side of politics between the interests of urban and rural voters can be resolved. There are many examples of the two groups clashing, betraying each other, and then reuniting in the face of a common enemy. The maxim, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," is particularly pertinent in politics, as is the maxim that in a political race, one should bet on self-interest. In this video, I'm going to discuss one of the many colourful events from the political history of the state of Victoria in the early 20th century. It marked the start of a period of 50 years of backstabbing and instability, which also provides quite handy illustrations of the operation of the reserve powers by state governors. At the Victorian state election on the 16th of November 1911, Labor won only 20 seats, whereas the Liberals, through their various factions, won 43 seats, which was quite a decisive victory. It was also the first Victorian election held using preferential voting and the first in which women could vote at the state level in Victoria. The Liberal Premier, John Murray, headed the rural faction of the Liberal Party, but upon his retirement, William Watt, who headed the urban faction, replaced him, becoming leader and premier in 1912. Now this caused the rural faction to become restless. Worse was to come. Watt introduced an electoral redistribution bill which would have made a small reduction to the large electoral malapportionment that had long existed in favour of country areas. Now, malapportionment means having grossly disproportionate numbers of voters in different electorates, usually smaller numbers of voters in rural electorates and large numbers in urban electorates. This is different from gerrymanders, which manipulate the electoral boundaries in order to achieve particular outcomes. And for those interested, I've done a video on that separately. The rural faction of the Liberal Party then decided to exercise its political muscle by joining with Labor to defeat the electoral redistribution bill. The rural Liberals wanted to defeat it because it lessened their political advantage by a little bit, while Labor wanted to defeat it because it didn't go far enough in eliminating the existing malapportionment. The leader of the rural faction within the Liberal Party, Donald MacLeod, thought that the consequence of defeating this bill would be that he would be asked to form a new Liberal government and become Premier. But he was to become rather surprised. The Premier, William Watt, wanted to crush this internal dissent within his party and restore discipline. So he decided to focus his party's attention on the enemy, Labor. And he did this by resigning on behalf of himself and his ministry and suggesting to the Lieutenant Governor, who was administering the state at that time, that the Labor leader should be called upon to form a government. As the appointment of a Premier is a reserve power, there was no conventional obligation on the Lieutenant Governor to take this advice, and some have suggested that he was actually in on the plan to help Watt. Whatever the truth of it, the Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Madden, called on the Labor leader, George Elmsley, to form a new government. In practice, Elmsley didn't have a hope of forming a stable minority government, as he did not have the numbers in the House. To complicate matters, in those days, the state constitution required that new ministers had to resign their seats in Parliament and recontest them in by-elections. And the idea behind that was that the people should be consulted about whether these particular politicians had their support to become ministers. By custom, however, these by-elections were usually unopposed and a mere formality. Normally, the House would have adjourned while the by-elections were held. But on this occasion, the opposition, which had the numbers, prevented an adjournment and kept the House in session, while Labor's senior members, including the Premier, could only sit in the Strangers' Gallery and watch the destruction of their newborn government. It was in fact the first time that Labor had held office in Victoria. The shock of that development, however, on those on the Conservative side and their move to the opposition benches was enough to unite the urban and the rural factions of the Liberal Party, at least for the time being, as you'll see in later videos. While the by-elections were not contested and Elmsley and his fellow ministers were all returned as politicians, a vote of no confidence in their government was passed by the Legislative Assembly. By convention, Elmsley either had to resign on behalf of the government or secure the dissolution of Parliament and an election. Elmsley went to see the Lieutenant Governor and requested a dissolution. He provided a letter setting out 5 reasons why a dissolution should be granted. The Lieutenant Governor then responded with detailed reasons rejecting all 5 arguments. The Lieutenant Governor contended that if Elmsley wanted a dissolution, he should have asked for it at the time that he was appointed. He might have been granted it if he had been able to show a reasonably well-founded belief that he could obtain a majority at the election to support his policy. But now that the factions of the Liberal Party had reunited, the Lieutenant Governor concluded that a majority government could be formed from within that Parliament without holding an election, and Elmsley was not in a position to ask for an election just to give him a chance to retain government. The Lieutenant Governor also noted that Elmsley had no prospect of obtaining supply to cover the election period, which he regarded as a, quote, very important factor, unquote. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a moment to note that it was the universal practice of vice-regal officers to refuse a dissolution to, and effectively to dismiss, governments that could not secure supply to cover an election period. This was not something new that just popped up at the time of the Whitlam dismissal. It comes up time and time again in Australia's constitutional history, particularly at the state level. And it should have been well known to Whitlam when he arrived at the Governor-General's office on the 11th of November asking for a half-Senate election with no supply to cover that election period. Now, going back to Elmsley's attempt to save his very short-lived government, the most contentious argument was that there should be a dissolution because the House had voted no confidence while the 6 ministerial by-elections were pending and before the government had had the opportunity to face the House and state its policy. Never before had a House of an Australian Parliament taken advantage of this initial absence of ministers to vote no confidence in the fledgling government. It was argued that if this became an accepted practice, no government would be able to be formed with a majority of less than 6, or it would be defeated before it could commence administering the state. In many cases, this would just leave the state completely ungovernable. While the Lieutenant Governor recognised this problem, he contended that a dissolution was not the solution. He argued that a dissolution should never be used as a penalty, but always to obtain the decision of the people as to the policy to be pursued by Parliament. He thought that the best approach in such circumstances was for the state's vice-regal officer to ignore votes of no confidence until such time as ministers have been re-elected in the by-elections. He concluded that a governor should not use his authority to dismiss his ministers except in a case where they have really and permanently lost the confidence of the House, but persist, notwithstanding, in retaining their offices. In the case of a temporary or technical loss of a majority, he considered that the vice-regal officer would always await the Premier's resignation if he saw fit to tender it, or would treat the vote carried against him as something unreal and accidental. However, in the current case, it was clear that even if all the ministers were re-elected, Elmsley still did not have the numbers to carry the support of the House. In fact, he had nowhere near the numbers to get majority support. He therefore denied Elmsley a dissolution. Watt was reappointed as Premier and he resumed governing with a much more united team. This story has two additional points of constitutional interest. The first is that the Lieutenant Governor, who exercised the reserve powers in refusing a dissolution to Elmsley, was the Chief Justice of Victoria, Sir John Madden. The observation is occasionally made that no Chief Justice has ever exercised a reserve power while administering the state as Lieutenant Governor. Now, as you can see, that's just not true. Judges have been involved in a number of exercises of the reserve powers, even though they may not be remembered today. Sir John Madden had previously refused a dissolution to Sir George Turner back in 1899. Sir William Cullen, the Chief Justice of New South Wales, refused a prorogation to William Holman in 1911, later agreeing to prorogue Parliament when a substitute government could not be formed. And you can see my video about that particular one, where Holman used a sleeping MP and a fast car to save his government. It's a good story. Another example is Justice Poole from South Australia, who administered the state in the absence of both the Governor and the Lieutenant Governor in the 1920s. He proved himself to be so annoying by refusing to act on advice unless he was convinced by the Attorney-General's advice on its legality, that South Australian ministers who had previously been lobbying the British for the appointment of Australians as governor gave up on that quest, preferring a compliant British aristocrat to a picky, vigilant Australian judge. But those aristocrats, once they became governor, when they were faced with a difficult constitutional dilemma, would always consult and seek the advice of the Chief Justice, who was commonly described as the Governor's constitutional advisor. Again, in 1975, it was claimed that it was extraordinary that the Governor-General should consult with the Chief Justice, Sir Garfield Barwick, about the exercise of his reserve powers. But anyone with a knowledge of constitutional history would know that this was the uniform practice, which had been going on for over a century, particularly at the state level and before that the colonial level, where the Chief Justice was also the Lieutenant Governor. In 1975, the controversy was heightened by the fact that Barwick had previously been a Liberal minister. It was argued that it was therefore utterly inappropriate for him to be involved. But in practice, many of those early Chief Justices had also been politicians. Sir John Madden, who as Lieutenant Governor refused that dissolution to Labor's George Elmsley, had previously been a Conservative minister in a Victorian government. Sir William Cullen, who had refused the prorogation to Labor's Holman in New South Wales, had also been a politician in the New South Wales Parliament. What can we draw from all of this? First, that tensions between the urban and the rural representatives on the Conservative side have existed for a long time. Second, that at least in the short term, tensions and splits can be papered over by focusing upon the common enemy as well as self-interest in securing and maintaining government. And finally, that nothing is new when it comes to politics. What is claimed to be extraordinary and unprecedented, whether in relation to 1975 or now, has usually been lived through before. We are just not very good at remembering our history. particularly our constitutional history. Thank you once again for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope this little snippet of constitutional history has given you some context in which to understand what's currently going on in Australian politics. And as always, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.